Welcome everyone. Today we will dive into the latest draft guidance from the Science-Based Target Initiative, which underscores the necessity for companies to focus on mandatory interim removal targets. We will explore how this new guidance presents an opportunity for businesses to invest in carbon removal projects earlier in the transition, with greater recognition for beyond value chain mitigation. Our goal is to help companies understand how they can actively take responsibility for their ongoing emission, especially in the context of SBTi's proposed changes. By way of background, as I think most of you know, SBTi launched a consultation on its update corporate net zero standard, introducing important changes that will shape how companies address their climate impact. We have put together a three-part webinar series to brief our corporate clients on what we think businesses need to know about SBTi's is evolving and what is the implication and opportunities for companies who look to comply with a net zero standard. We already had a first webinar in the series back in April on Scope 3 instruments and new related guidance. Today, in the second webinar of the series, we will cover beyond value chain mitigation and neutralization. In its latest draft guidance, the SBTi proposed mandatory interim removal target and increased recognition for BVCM, encouraging companies to invest earlier in the carbon removals and take responsibility for ongoing emissions. So in this 30-minute session, we will go beyond the technical definition to explore what these changes mean for corporate climate strategies and how companies can proactively build a high-quality carbon credit portfolio that aligns with evolving expectations. Just a bit of housekeeping rules for today. As you see, you are all muted, and this will be for the duration of the session. Please do post any question in the Q&A box, and we'll also answer them, some of these during the Q&A session at the end. If we don't get your question today, we will respond via email after the webinar. Finally, the session will be recorded and sent to all who registered today. Let's introduce the speaker of today. With us, we have Alice Rimpot, Senior Managing Consultant for Climate Strategy at South Pole. We also have Robbie Green, Sustainability Advisor at South Pole, and myself, Alberto Lanzoni, Head of Sales at Southern Europe, hosting this session. Now, let's dive into the version 2 of the Corporate Net Zero Standard, and I will hand over to the next speaker.
Great, thanks Alberto. Good, so as, hello everyone. So as Alberto just mentioned, and as you're all aware, the SBTi is currently revising its corporate net zero standard and put out for consultation that version 2 of the standard. There's a lot of very interesting changes in that standard, a lot of things that will change the way companies set targets and address their emissions. One thing regarding the timeline is that this standard, the final version, is expected to be published next year, 2026, and to come into effect in 2027. What that means for companies that they can still set targets at the moment, and then companies will need from 2030 or whenever their existing targets end, whatever comes first, they will then need to start using the new standard. Next one, please. Oh. Thank you. Yes, perfect. So within all the, fine with the next one. So within, thanks. So as said, the standard is really revising, touching on all the different aspects of net zero strategies. But for today's session, we'll be focusing on not the part of reduction targets, but the part on how companies should be looking at addressing their residual emissions through neutralization but also take responsibility for their ongoing impact, so addressing their ongoing emissions through beyond value chain mitigation. So we'll be focusing on these two aspects of the new standard. And first, let's define briefly what these terms mean. Next slide, please. So starting with ongoing emissions. So ongoing emissions are the emissions released by a company from basically their target year, base year until the target year. And so, yeah, basically everything that is emitted during the transition to net zero. And these ongoing emissions can be addressed through beyond value chain mitigations, which refers to a company's effort to sort of take responsibility for their ongoing impact through efforts outside of their own value chain. Then once at net zero, we have residual emissions, which are the emissions left after all abatement measures have been implemented. So basically what is left once a company has achieved its long-term reduction target. And the expectation is that these residual emissions should be counterbalanced or neutralized through the procurement of removal credits. So again, when you think ongoing emissions, beyond value chain mitigation, and when you think of residual emissions, that's where neutralization comes in. Next slide, please. So now let's look at the key changes that the SBTi is introducing in the new draft. First of all, regarding beyond value chain mitigation. Next slide, please. Great. So BVCM still remains a recommendation, not a requirement. However, the SBTi is looking at incentivizing BVCM further, but by providing recognition for companies that do engage in BVCM activities. The exact criteria or conditions that companies will need to meet to receive that recognition are still to be defined through the consultation process. These criteria are looking at the scope of BVCM, at the scale, so how many at the scale of the activities, as well as, for example, the status regarding reduction targets. Could company receive recognition whether they're on track with their reduction targets, or could they also receive recognition if they're falling behind, but sort of compensating the fact that they're lagging? One other thing that is being introduced is whether companies would be expected to basically to finance these BVCM activities annually, or if that could be at the end of the target cycle, so every 5 years, which can be interesting in terms of when you think of some of the issuance cycle of credits. So that's for BVCM. Now, neutralization is also, so next slide, yeah, perfect. So regarding neutralization, quite a few key changes. First of all, the SBTi is introducing potentially scope 1, removal targets, interim targets on scope 1 residual emissions. And it's looking here at different options, either making this a requirement or providing recognitions for companies who do that, who would set these interim targets. Or the last option would be to give flexibilities to companies to address their residual emissions on scope 1, either through further reduction or through removals. Another key change compared to the current version that just mentions that companies should be using removals for neutralization, the SBTi is here introducing criteria on the durability of removals that should be used to match residual emissions, with two approaches, different approaches being put forward. First one is a gradual transition. So that would mean that companies would be expected to gradually increase the share of removals with higher durability in their portfolio. Or the second option, which would be a like-for-like approach. A like-for-like approach means that companies should look at the residual emissions in terms of individual greenhouse gases, so CO2, nitrous oxide, methane, etc., and match the type of removals they purchase with the lifetime of these individual gases. Third change is regarding value chain partners. So while the SBTi is looking at, is basically looking at interim targets only for scope 1 in their current draft, they still expect that all residual emissions across scopes should be addressed from the net zero target year. And here they introduced the idea that, well, let's say the possibility that scope 3 residual emissions could be addressed by value chain partners instead of the company itself. So what that means is, for example, that one of your suppliers could be addressing their own scope 1 and 2 and purchasing renewable credits for that, and then therefore you would not have to buy yourself renewable credits to address your supplier's emission. And finally, one thing that the SBTi will also define further in the new draft is what are the key criteria to constitute high integrity, high quality removal credits. So that's it for the key changes. Next slide, please. Yes, and now I'll hand over to Robbie to talk about how to get started.
Great, excellent. Thanks for that, Alice. Right, so now what we've covered some of the key potential changes may look like. Let's take a look at how this actually affects businesses, why it's important, and also kind of fundamentally how to actually push ahead. So Alberto, can we jump into the next slide, please? So great, thanks. So to kick off, we want to briefly discuss the why. There's been plenty of discussion around these changes, and while it can often feel somewhat distant from the practical day-to-day, it's important to recognize the potential effects sooner rather than later in order to give you space and time to actually prepare. So first, it's worth noting that despite some of the uncertainty with the application of credits towards targets, we're seeing actually a much clearer use case emerging from the SBTi. So while to some extent, as Alice mentioned, these are pointing more for just sort of additional recognition, on a neutralisation side, we may be speaking towards more mandatory or almost compliance sort of led targets. So this is now starting to reflect the wider consensus that we're actually seeing, that there is really no net zero without a functioning and really effective carbon market. So this all means that carbon markets will likely play a role in companies' net zero strategies, and therefore, if they want to remain on track, they'll really need to engage quite holistically. And then another piece which is becoming increasingly important is actually the security of supply. So up until this point, the carbon market has relied quite greatly on voluntary efforts in order to provide the demand signals to actually scale the market. But we're now seeing increasing sort of layers of compliance mechanisms under airlines and regional tax systems, just as an example, which are starting to really underpin this voluntary demand. So should the standards to the, or the changes to the standard include these mandatory removal targets, this will naturally drive up demand further. So this is really important because the timeframes actually inherent in carbon projects to issue credits, or given those timeframes inherent in carbon projects, we may well see the demand starting to actually exceed supply in the short term in order to secure a portfolio of carbon removals at an appropriate cost. But it's also worth thinking that the ratings agencies are actually already starting to see a greater correlation between their ratings and the price premiums out in projects in the market. And certainly, here at South Pole, we're seeing that reflected in our own transactions on a day-to-day basis. So this altogether really indicates to us that there's already a market pressure for high-rated projects, which is likely to increase with that demand pressure increasing too. So these two pieces then together, both the compliance angle from the SBTi and then the price and supplies pressure building, mean it's really more important than ever for companies to rationalize these costs internally. And I think if we look back, historically, companies have taken a very annual approach to their procurement. But with these targets in place, companies will really need to match these long-term commitments with a long-term strategy. And ultimately, embedding these costs early should prevent companies being exposed to the market conditions and also ensure companies are able to meet these sort of long-term commitments and potential interim targets that we're looking at. But we want to look at sort of how to set some of this up. So Alice, perhaps you can dive into some of that how.
Yes, so great. So once you've decided to start taking action, how should you go about it, and how can you start developing your BVCM and neutralization strategy? Next slide, please. So we've broken, exactly. Perfect, thank you. We've broken that down into sort of 3 steps. First of all, define your needs. So that means first start estimating your emissions. So both your projected residual emissions and your ongoing emissions. Then define your targets. So what would be your interim targets and what would be the implications in terms of durability of removals? Again, so basically depending potentially on the outcome of the consultation, but define so your volumes, your targets. Regarding BVCM, recommend actually defining your budget. So what is considered best practice now is rather moving away from a ton for ton approach and looking at a money for ton. So to define a budget for your beyond value chain mitigation activities, for example, through an internal carbon price. So once you've defined your needs, then you can look at the portfolio that you want to build to match that needs. So that's where you can bring in basically define your preferences. So bring in the type of credits, look at the type of credits that would match your needs, but also your broader business goals. So typically there might be certain credits or certain types of projects that you prefer based on certain geographies, if you operate in certain locations, based on you might be looking for certain co-benefits in terms of social co-benefits, biodiversity, etc., depending on your type of business and the type of narrative you want to have around it. So then combining your preferences and your target requirements, that will then help you define what is your budget. That also has an implication, of course. That will then help you define what your portfolio mix should look like. Then the last step is to define how you want to procure these credits. There's not necessarily one size fits all, and there might be different approaches that you decide at different steps of your strategies. But to give you an example of some of the main procurement approaches that exist, you might choose, so spot purchase, which would mean buying directly off-the-shelf credits for an immediate purchase, forward offtake agreement, so you can secure some volume and pricing. You can look at direct investment in a specific project or a pooled investment, such as, for example, a buyers club like NextGen, or through a fund if you want to access a diversified portfolio. So basically you have all these different approaches, and the one you will choose, either one or several maybe, will depend on the type of credits you're looking for, as well as your tolerance to risk, and basically the timeline and budget that you have. So yeah, and then I'll pass back to Robbie to talk about, once you've developed your strategy, how to then execute it.
Great, thanks, Alice. And maybe we can move to the next slide. Yeah, excellent. Right, so while a lot of the focus on the market over the last couple of years has been on policy changes, upcoming regulation, quality criteria, and claims guidance, we also want to provide some really concrete steps that companies can take in order to actually engage the market and begin executing a fully developed plan. So once companies have developed a plan in line with the features that Alice mentioned, companies should be looking towards that implementation and execution stage. So our first port of call here is going to be to reach out to a broad spectrum of market participants to understand, first off, the guidance, the support, and the services which are available. Then, depending upon the strategy, companies may be able to consider speaking to, again, project developers. There can be market aggregators, ratings agencies like B0 and Silvera, data providers like Allied Offsets, and then also financiers and banks, but among others, a huge host, to have a really holistic understanding of what can be achieved in the market and what's best practice in the market. But then, as with any commitment, companies are going to be needing to conduct their own due diligence, and we're really going to hammer this point. This due diligence should focus across your engagement, and not only on the projects and the quality, but also due diligence on your selected partners to ensure that they're meeting your expectations of integrity and, again, acting appropriately in the market. Ultimately, conducting this due diligence is really essential, both to ensure that the work being done is translating to effective reductions and removals on the ground, as well as to ensure that you as a company are protecting yourself from a risk of greenwashing. Then, as well as your own due diligence, while some companies may be able to perform this internally, most are probably going to be looking at leaning on a cohort of services, such as I mentioned, such as those ratings agencies and also independent market aggregators to assist. So that's sort of 2 points on the due diligence. Then finally, it's aware that, as with everything, we're going to see a continuous improvements in the market over time. Companies are really going to have to remain on top of their carbon credit commitments to ensure that they're remaining in line with those best practices which they identified, and also keeping a lookout for new opportunities which pop up in the market. So this again means that companies are going to need to stay in contact with their credit providers, with project developers, with due diligence partners, to really understand the policy updates such as these which are coming out, and any updates to regulation. And of course, the really vital one is monitoring the issuance and delivery of their credits which they've secured. And then in addition, as the market supply and demand shifts, companies are going to need to remain somewhat flexible to update their procurement strategies and approaches as things change. So those are sort of the three concrete areas that we want to look at when actually executing a plan. But let's jump into the next slide. We can give a bit of an example. Perfect. So we just want to point to an example of a company that we feel, looking at from the outside, is tackling this challenge in quite a considered and successful way. Maybe I should just mention this is all sort of public information that we've got off Swiss Re's website, and something that we want to drag out. So first off, Swiss Re have built out a really robust strategy which is integrated into a wider decarbonisation pathway. That's always going to be the first port of call and is really important for companies to tackle first off. But then second, getting into the strategy a bit more, their choice of credit type is really aligned with best practice and also market trajectory. So they've got a blend of avoidance and removal credits, with that removal portion increasing over time. This is really powerful because it balances the need to protect carbon sinks at the moment, while also moving in line with that net zero neutralisation requirements as their target year gets closer and approaches. So that's also really useful. Then a key part of their strategy also lies in the varied approach to procurement of credits. So Swiss Re actually layer multiple solutions together to ensure that they meet their requirements, obviously by volume, but also reducing the risk of delivery failures and balancing that with acceptable cost profiles to them. So Swiss Re use sort of current short-term transactions across individual projects to meet their operational greenhouse gas emissions, but then they also look to the future with a long-term offtake agreement with a direct air capture firm to then lock in costs and those volumes sort of well into the early 2030s. And then in addition to that, they're also a founding member of NextGen, which is a South Pole Buyers Club, I think Alice mentioned earlier. And that's then again to secure those long-term volumes of technical removals at a fixed price for that future supply. So again, we're talking about layering those different solutions together to ensure that you're mitigating hedging price and delivery risks with those sort of flexible buying patterns which can evolve over time. So this is an example of a company that we from the outside I think are doing many things very well. Maybe moving on to some of the recommendations. On to the next slide. And then diving straight in, I think we can skip the slide. Yeah, perfect, thank you. So we want to leave you with two recommendations which ultimately remain applicable if you're at the beginning of your engagement with carbon markets or if you're a sort of seasoned veteran. So first and foremost, like any market in the 21st century, things are changing really quickly, and building a strong bed of knowledge will really serve you well. So it's important to ensure first that your teams are across the requirements and potential obligations which you have, whether that means leaning on internal stakeholders or leveraging external support from market experts. It's really helpful to build your own internal framework so you can approach the market and its changes sort of systematically and effectively. That internal framework should be built upon sort of key criteria, so including project quality metrics, standards and certifications, procurement types, and durability thresholds and metrics, like Alice mentioned. And then second, like I said, I'm really going to hammer this point as much as possible, is the due diligence. Like I said earlier, this is a really fundamental piece that anyone who's looking to engage in the market must undertake. This means, again, effectively interrogating your market partners and leveraging a network of independent experts in order to build your framework, and also diving into project specifics to understand the potential risks in each project, be they from a country risk, a policy risk, or indeed a project performance risk. So having a strong standpoint in both of these areas, both sort of building the knowledge and then having the due diligence, is going to be really vital. And ultimately, it'd be remiss of me if I didn't say that. Obviously, South Pole teams are here to help clients sort of build and execute in this market. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. But I think I know we've got a few minutes left, and I'm keen to dive into some questions. So Alberto, perhaps I can bring it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Alice and Robbie, for the clear presentation. Now let's examine some of the questions we have received so far from the audience. So the first question that we got is, how do we avoid the risk of being called out for greenwashing? I think this might go for you, Alice.
Sure. Thanks, Alberto. Yeah, very good question. I mean, I think looking at the SBTi, I mean, when you look at the market nowadays and at companies' net zero strategies, what we see is, on one hand, on the supply side of credits, there's been really a strong increase in the focus on, I mean, Robbie mentioned due diligence several times, but an increase in the requirements basically on the integrity and the quality of credits. There are, for example, if you think of ICBCM and their CCP label, if you look at the rise of rating agencies, so there's a lot more scrutiny and basically the new generations of credits that are really ensured to be of high quality, high integrity. If you look on the demand side, so basically how companies, more than demand side, but rather how companies are using credits within their net zero strategies, the fact that we now have more defined frameworks that explain what role credits can play in company strategies makes it more helpful for companies to use carbon credits within their strategies, but in a way that is still aligned with science and still considered credible. And by that, I mean typically here, we always talk about, well, basically decarbonization should come first, but the SBTi is also acknowledging the essential role that credits play both for neutralization and on their transition to net zero. So what I would say to companies that are looking at integrating then carbon credits in their strategy is to basically follow best practice and report transparently on your emissions, your progress on reduction, and how you're using credits within that. And be careful with the claims you're making. The new draft is also providing more guidance on the type of claims. We see also regulation changing around this, with a lot more being put around what type of claims companies can make based on what they do. So follow best practice and you should be fine.
Very clear, Alice. Thank you. We have another question coming. What key due diligence question should we be asking of our partners? So I think this might go to you, Robbie.
Yeah, sure. Happy to take this one quickly. Yeah, also a really important question. And I guess it depends whether you're doing, to some extent, procurement in-house or if you're leaning on other teams. I would say if you're doing procurement in-house, you should have a team built across policy, carbon project development, sort of financial risk, and they should all be able to interrogate that side of things. But if, as most companies will be, you're leaning on market partners, you should really interrogate them on their own carbon asset development due diligence work. And crucially, the partners that are themselves working on those projects to ensure that they're providing the sort of high integrity credits that you should expect. So I think that the key questions that you should be looking at is, asking them and your market aggregators, your asset developers to provide evidence for past performance, as well as things around risk identification and mitigation, again, at a project level and a partner level, so you can get really the whole spectrum. So that's where we'd start.
Thank you, Alice and Robbie, for the clear answers. And then let's wrap it up, also being mindful of the time. So as we conclude, I'll provide a preview of our next webinar titled Climate Transition Plans, New Expectation, happening on May 28th. This session aims to provide valuable insights on how strong transition plans not only help businesses meet their net zero goals, but also serve as strategic tools for competitiveness, investment attraction, and driving long-term growth and innovation. For those of you who don't know, South Pole is a global climate solution company specializing in climate, sustainability, nature, and carbon markets. We have been around for 20 years and brings this deep experience into everything that we do. We are a leading consulting company on topics such as Scope 3, climate risk, target setting, and we are also seller of environmental certificates and one of the largest carbon project asset developers globally. We employ over 800 people across 30 different countries, and we have a strong regional presence in APAC as well. Well, it's all for today. Thank you for joining us. We hope this session provided you valuable insights into BVCM and neutralization and why early action matter. Also, thank you to the speakers of today. If you haven't already, be sure to register for our latest webinar of the series, Climate Transition Plan. As we said, coming on 28th of May. In this session, we will break down draft guidance, how SBTi applies to it, and explore the business case for strong CTPs, helping companies navigate the risk, building resilience, and align with investors, regulatory and strategic expectations. Don't miss this opportunity to stay ahead of these crucial updates. Register now, and we'll see you there. Thank you again, and have a great day.